She stood in the marketplace with calloused fingers and empty pockets, willing to trade the only thing she had left, herself, for a loaf of bread. But when a man in expensive boots saw her desperation, he didn't offer charity. He offered something that would change everything: dignity, silk dresses, and a love so pure it would heal wounds she didn't even know existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut through Boston's financial district like a blade, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts and the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. It was 1892, and the city buzzed with the energy of progress. Electric streetlights flickered to life along the cobblestone streets, while horse-drawn carriages clattered past the newly constructed department stores. But for Isabella Martinez, standing in the shadow of Quincy Market, with her threadbare shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, progress felt like something that happened to other people. Her fingers, stained permanently with indigo dye from countless hours bent over fabric, trembled as she counted the 3 pennies in her palm for the 4th time that morning. 3 pennies. That was all that remained of her week's wages from Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, where she worked 14 hours a day, hunched over intricate beadwork and delicate hemlines for wealthy women who never looked her in the eye. Tea market bustled around her with the chaos of early commerce. Fishermen hawked their morning catch, their voices carrying over the crowd in thick Irish accents. Flower vendors arranged bouquets of late-season chrysanthemums in wooden buckets. Bread sellers displayed golden loaves that made Isabella's stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, not since she'd given her last decent meal to Mrs. O'Brien's sick child in the tenement room next to hers. Isabella pulled her mother's rosary from beneath her worn collar, the silver beads cool against her palm. She whispered a prayer in Spanish, the language of her childhood, in the small village outside Santa Fe, where her parents had sewn leather goods for travelers heading west. Before the fever took them both when she was 16, before she'd used every penny they'd saved to travel east, chasing promises of steady work in the textile factories, before she'd learned that promises were often just pretty words that dissolved like sugar in rain. The dress shop where she worked belonged to Mrs. Henrietta Henderson, a stern woman with steel-grey hair who ran her establishment like a military operation. Isabella had been grateful for the position when she'd first arrived in Boston, grateful enough to accept wages that barely covered the rent for her corner room in a crumbling boarding house. But gratitude doesn't fill an empty stomach, and dignity doesn't keep the cold from seeping through broken windows. Her skill with needle and thread was undeniable. Isabella could transform the plainest fabric into something magnificent, could repair tears so seamlessly they disappeared entirely, could add embellishments that turned simple dresses into works of art. Mrs. Henderson knew this, which was why she kept Isabella working in the back room, where customers couldn't see her patched skirts and worn shoes, couldn't witness the poverty that somehow made her artistry seem less valuable. The other seamstresses at the shop, Margaret, who came from a respectable family in Beacon Hill, and Sarah, whose father owned a small printing business, spoke to Isabella with polite distance. They brought lunches packed by servants and wore different dresses each day of the week. They spoke of weekend visits to relatives in the countryside and theatre performances they'd attended. Isabella listened while she worked, her hands never pausing in their intricate dance across silk and satin, her mind cataloguing a world that felt as foreign as the moon. Yesterday had been the worst day yet. Mrs. Henderson had summoned Isabella to the front of the shop, where a woman in an elaborate burgundy dress waited with her arms crossed. The dress, one Isabella had spent 3 weeks perfecting, adding hundreds of tiny pearls by hand in an intricate floral pattern, hung between them like evidence in a trial. "This is completely unacceptable," the woman had declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Look at this stitching here and here. It's uneven, sloppy. I specifically requested your finest work for my daughter's engagement party, and this is what you deliver?" Isabella had stepped closer, her trained eye immediately spotting what the woman pointed to. The stitching was perfect, each pearl aligned with mathematical precision, every stitch smaller and more consistent than even the most expensive dresses sold in the grand department stores downtown. But she remained silent, knowing that defending her work would only make things worse. Mrs. Henderson, sensing the loss of an important customer, nodded gravely. "I sincerely apologize, Mrs. Whitman. This is, indeed, substandard work. I'll have it completely redone at no charge, and I'll personally ensure our most experienced seamstress handles the alterations." Isabella's heart had sunk. 3 weeks of work, dismissed with a few words. 3 weeks for which she now wouldn't be paid, since Mrs. Henderson deducted the cost of substandard work from wages. Furthermore, Mrs. Henderson had continued, "I'll be reassigning this seamstress to more appropriate tasks. Perhaps alterations on day dresses would be more suitable to her skill level." The demotion meant a reduction in already meager wages. It meant more hours for less money. It meant the difference between barely surviving and not surviving at all. Standing now in the market, Isabella watched a young mother purchase a loaf of bread and hand pieces to her 2 small children. Their faces lit up as they bit into the soft crust, and Isabella felt something twist painfully in her chest. Not just hunger, but a deeper ache. The realization that she had no one to share bread with, even if she could afford it. No family to worry about her empty stomach. No friends to notice if she simply disappeared from the streets of Boston entirely. The morning crowd began to thin as people headed to their jobs. Clerks hurrying toward office buildings, domestic workers making their way to fine houses on Commonwealth Avenue, factory workers trudging toward the mills that belched smoke into the gray sky. Isabella remained frozen in place, paralyzed by the mathematics of desperation. 3 pennies wouldn't buy bread, wouldn't buy a room for another night, wouldn't buy the needle and thread she needed to take in private sewing work. Group of well-dressed men passed by, their conversation floating over the market noise. They spoke of railroad investments and steel production, of profits from western cattle ranches and shipping ventures. One of them, tall with dark hair beneath an expensive hat, glanced in her direction for just a moment. His eyes were the color of deep water, and something in his expression made Isabella instinctively step backward into the shadows between vendor stalls. Rich men noticed poor women for only one reason, and Isabella had witnessed enough transactions in the boarding house to know what that attention cost. But as her stomach cramped with hunger and her worn shoes let the cold cobblestones press against her feet, she found herself calculating even that terrible math. How much would a night's work buy? Enough bread for a week? Enough to pay Mrs. Henderson for thread and fabric to start her own small sewing business? The thought made her feel sick, but desperation has a way of making the unthinkable seem merely unpleasant. She watched the group of men disappear around a corner, heading toward what looked like an expensive restaurant where a single meal probably cost more than she earned in a month. A vendor called out about fresh apples, his voice jovial and warm. Isabella touched the rosary beads again, remembering her mother's voice teaching her prayers, her father's hands guiding hers as she learned to cut leather with precision. They had been poor but proud, earning their bread through honest work and sleeping peacefully each night, knowing they owed no one their dignity. But dignity doesn't cure hunger, and pride doesn't pay rent. Isabella closed her eyes and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. She would find those men. She would offer what she had to offer. She would trade the only thing of value she possessed for enough money to survive another week, maybe 2 if she was careful. The church bells chimed again, marking another hour in a city that moved forward without noticing who got left behind. Isabella squared her shoulders, tucked the rosary back beneath her collar, and began walking in the direction the men had gone. Each step felt like a small death, but each step was also a choice to live another day. She didn't know that her life was about to change completely, didn't know that the man with the deep water eyes had noticed more than just her poverty, didn't know that sometimes salvation comes wearing expensive boots and speaking with a voice that carries the authority of someone who has never doubted his place in the world. All she knew was hunger, desperation, and the weight of a decision that felt like the only choice she had left. But in a city built on the dreams of people who had lost everything and started over, sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. Sometimes the moment when you think you have nothing left to lose is exactly when everything worth having finally finds you. Isabella followed the cobblestone path that wound through Boston's financial district, her worn shoes silent against the smooth stones. The group of men had vanished around the corner near State Street, where the city's most prestigious establishments lined the thoroughfare like soldiers in formation. Gas lamps flickered in the growing dusk, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow her small frame as she moved deeper into a world where her presence felt like trespassing. The restaurant they had entered stood before her like a monument to wealth. The Union Club, with its brass nameplate polished to mirror brightness and windows that glowed golden from within. Through the glass, she could see men in dark suits seated at tables draped with white linen, crystal glasses catching the light from elaborate chandeliers. The scene looked like a painting, beautiful and completely separate from her reality. Isabella's resolve wavered as she stood on the sidewalk, watching well-dressed patrons enter and exit with the casual confidence of people who belonged everywhere they went. A doorman in a burgundy uniform stood at attention, his white gloves pristine, his posture speaking of years spent distinguishing between those worthy of entrance and those who should be turned away with a single glance. Her reflection in the restaurant's window showed her exactly what the doorman would see. A young woman with olive skin darkened by long hours in dim workrooms, black hair escaping from a simple bun, a grey wool dress that had been mended so many times the original. Fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. Her shawl, knitted by her mother's hands years ago, was the finest thing she owned, but even its intricate pattern couldn't disguise the poverty that clung to her like smoke. A carriage pulled up to the curb, its wheels scraping against stone, with a sound like breaking bones. The driver, perched high on his seat, tipped his hat to a gentleman emerging from the restaurant. Isabella recognized him immediately, the tall man with dark hair who had glanced her way in the market. Up close, she could see the quality of his clothing, a wool coat that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, leather gloves that spoke of money and taste, boots that had never known a day of real work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command, someone whose word carried weight in rooms where decisions shaped the fates of thousands. But there was something in his manner, a careful distance from the other men, a way of listening more than speaking, that set him apart from the typical businessman who measured worth only in dollars and influence. "Mr. Blackwood," the doorman said with respectful familiarity, "shall I have your carriage brought around?" "Not yet, Henry. I think I'll walk for a while. The evening air does me good." His voice carried the refined accent of Eastern education, layered over something else, a hint of Western expansiveness that suggested open skies and endless horizons. Isabella had heard similar voices among the wealthy women who came to Mrs. Henderson's shop, women who had married railroad barons and cattle kings, bringing Eastern sophistication to Western fortunes. As Mr. Blackwood began walking in her direction, Isabella felt panic rise in her throat like bitter medicine. This man belonged to a world of board meetings and investment decisions, of private clubs and social expectations. What could she possibly offer him? What words could bridge the vast canyon between his reality and hers? But hunger is a cruel teacher, and desperation its most devoted student. Isabella stepped forward just as he passed beneath a gas lamp, the light illuminating the sharp planes of his face and the steady intelligence in his dark eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, turned, and studied her with an expression she couldn't read. Not disgust, not dismissal, but something like curiosity mixed with concern. For a long moment they stood in silence, while the sounds of the city continued around them. Horses' hooves on cobblestone, distant laughter from the restaurant, the far-off whistle of a departing train. "Yes," he said finally, his tone neither warm nor cold, simply attentive. Isabella's carefully rehearsed words died in her throat. Standing before this man, she felt the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment, leaving Santa Fe with dreams of independence, accepting wages that barely sustained life, spending her last pennies on thread instead of bread. But looking into his eyes, she saw something unexpected. Patience. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't looking past her to more important concerns. He was waiting, as if whatever she had to say might actually matter. She began, then stopped, pressing her lips together to keep them from trembling. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" he asked, his voice gentler now. The kindness in his tone nearly undid her completely. When had anyone last asked about her welfare with genuine concern? Mrs. Henderson certainly never inquired about her seamstress's well-being beyond their ability to complete assigned tasks. The other women at the boarding house were too consumed with their own struggles to spare energy for anyone else's. "I'm looking for work," she managed to say, though the words felt like stones in her mouth. He glanced around the empty street, then back at her face. "At this hour? In this neighborhood?" Heat flooded her cheeks as the implication of his questions sank in. Of course, he would assume the worst. What other kind of work would a poor woman seek from wealthy men in the shadows of expensive restaurants? But instead of the disgust she expected to see in his expression, she found something that looked almost like sadness. "What sort of work?" he asked quietly. The question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Isabella lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze directly. If she was going to sacrifice her dignity, she would do it with whatever pride remained to her. "Whatever you're willing to pay for," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Blackwood studied her for another long moment, his dark eyes moving from her face to her hands, the hands that betrayed her trade with their calluses and stains, the hands that could transform rough fabric into beauty but couldn't seem to grasp prosperity for their owner. "You're a seamstress," he said. It wasn't a question. Isabella blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Your fingers, the way you hold yourself. My sister runs a dress shop in San Francisco. I've learned to recognize the signs." He paused, then added, "Also, there's a thread caught in your hair. Silk, from the look of it. Expensive. Silk." Self-consciously, Isabella reached up and found the errant thread, a remnant from the pearl-encrusted dress that had cost her a week's wages. She pulled it free and let it drift to the ground like a small surrender. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The directness of the question caught her off guard. She wanted to lie, to preserve some shred of dignity, but her empty stomach chose that moment to betray her with an audible protest. Mr. Blackwood's expression shifted, not to pity, which would have humiliated her, but to something that looked like recognition. "When did you last eat?" he pressed. "Yesterday," she admitted, then corrected herself with painful honesty. "No, the day before that." He was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back as he seemed to wrestle with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to solving problems efficiently. "There's a small cafe too, blocks from here, clean, quiet, respectable. They serve excellent beef stew and fresh bread." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, extracting several bills without counting them. "This should cover a proper meal and lodging for the night." Isabella stared at the money in his outstretched hand. More cash than she had seen in months. But something in his manner, the careful way he held the bills, suggested this wasn't the transaction she had been prepared to make. "I don't understand," she said. "You're hungry. I have money. The mathematics are simple enough. But what do you want in return?" A shadow crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Nothing. Sometimes kindness is just kindness." Isabella had lived in Boston long enough to know that nothing was ever that simple, especially between men and women of vastly different circumstances. She searched his face for signs of hidden expectations, for the calculating look she had seen in other men's eyes when they measured what they might extract from desperation. Instead, she found something that confused her more than any clear demand would have. Sincerity. "I can't," she said finally. "Why not?" "Because I don't know what it costs." Mr. Blackwood lowered his hand but didn't return the money to his wallet. "You assume there must be a cost. There's always a cost. Perhaps, but not always the one you expect." He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could read the entire story of her life in her expression. "What's your name?" "Isabella Martinez." "Well, Miss Martinez, I'm going to make you an unusual offer. Accept this money for a meal and a room. In return, tomorrow morning, come to the address I'm going to give you. I have a proposition that might interest you, one that involves your skills with needle and thread, not other considerations." He pulled a calling card from his coat pocket and handed it to her along with the money. The card was heavy, expensive paper with engraved lettering that read Jonathan Blackwood, Blackwood Enterprises, Cattle and Land Development. Below that, an address on Beacon Hill that Isabella recognized as one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "The legitimate kind. I need someone with exceptional seamstress skills for a project that requires both talent and discretion. The pay would be generous, more than generous, if your work proves as skilled as I suspect it is." Isabella turned the card over in her hands, feeling the weight of possibility and suspicion in equal measure. "Why me? You don't know anything about my abilities." "I know you're desperate enough to approach a stranger on a dark street. But proud enough to ask what the cost will be before accepting help. I know you work with expensive materials based on that silk thread, which suggests someone trusts you with valuable goods. And I know you've been trying to make an honest living in a city that doesn't make that easy for women without connections or capital." His assessment was so accurate it made her feel transparent, as if all her struggles and compromises were written plainly across her skin. But there was no judgment in his voice, only the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating observable facts. "What if I take your money and don't come tomorrow?" she asked. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. "Then you'll have a decent meal and a safe place to sleep tonight, and I'll be out the cost of both. I've made worse investments." The casual way he dismissed what represented survival to her should have been insulting, but instead, Isabella found it oddly reassuring. This wasn't charity driven by pity or self-importance. This was someone solving a practical problem with practical means. "The cafe is called Murphy's," he continued. "Tell them Jonathan Blackwood sent you, and they'll see you're fed and given a clean room. Tomorrow, if you choose to come, we'll discuss the details of my proposition." Isabella looked down at the money in her hand, enough to eat well for days, enough to buy the thread and fabric she needed to start taking in private work, enough to pay another week's rent at the boarding house. It represented more immediate security than she had known in months. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Jonathan Blackwood was already turning to leave, but he paused at her question. "Because 3 years ago I watched someone I cared about die from pride. She was too stubborn to accept help when it was offered, too independent to admit she needed assistance. I learned that sometimes the greatest kindness is simply removing someone's need to choose between dignity and survival." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow both formal and intimate. "Good evening, Miss Martinez. I hope to see you tomorrow." As he walked away, his figure gradually swallowed by the shadows between gas lamps, Isabella stood motionless on the empty street. In her hand, she held more money than she had earned. In the past month, along with a calling card that represented possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of bread and roasted meat from nearby establishments. For the first time in weeks, the prospect of a full meal seemed real and immediate. But more than hunger, something else stirred in her chest, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. Hope tomorrow would bring its own challenges and decisions. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Boston, Isabella Martinez would sleep with a full stomach and a roof over her head, gifts from a stranger who asked for nothing in return, except the possibility of her presence the following day. As she made her way toward Murphy's Cafe, the calling card clutched securely in her palm. She wondered what kind of man gave money to desperate women without demanding payment in flesh or servitude. What kind of proposition awaited her on Beacon Hill? And why did she find herself looking forward to discovering the answers, despite every lesson poverty had taught her about being cautious with hope? The questions followed her through the cafe door, where the warmth and the scent of fresh bread promised that tomorrow, at least, would begin with more possibilities than today had offered. The morning sun painted Beacon Hill in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the brick sidewalks where centuries of Boston's elite had walked before Isabella Martinez ever set foot in the city. She stood at the corner of Mount Vernon Street, clutching Jonathan Blackwood's calling card like a talisman, staring up at the imposing townhouse that bore the address printed in elegant script. The building rose 4 stories into the crisp October sky, its red brick facade adorned with black shutters and window boxes that still held the last blooms of autumn chrysanthemums. A wrought-iron fence enclosed a small front garden where precisely trimmed hedges formed geometric patterns around a central fountain. Everything about the house spoke of old money, established power, and the kind of permanence that came from generations of careful investment and social positioning. Isabella had spent the night at Murphy's Cafe in a clean room with actual sheets on the bed and a window that looked out onto a courtyard instead of a brick wall. She had eaten beef stew thick with vegetables and potatoes, fresh bread with real butter, and apple pie that reminded her of her mother's baking. For the first time in months, she had slept without hunger gnawing at her stomach, without the constant worry of where tomorrow's meal would come from. But sleep had been elusive for other reasons. Questions circled through her mind like restless birds. What kind of work could a wealthy cattle rancher possibly have for a seamstress? Why had he chosen her, of all people, for this mysterious proposition? And most troubling of all, why had his kindness felt so genuine when every instinct taught by poverty warned her that men like Jonathan Blackwood never gave without expecting far more in return? She had risen before dawn, using the basin and pitcher in her room to wash as thoroughly as possible, attempting to transform her appearance from desperate to merely poor. Her grey dress was still patched and faded, but it was clean, and she had managed to work most of the tangles from her long black hair before pinning it into a neat chignon. The reflection in the small mirror showed a young woman who looked tired and thin, but no longer quite so defeated. Now, standing before his door, Isabella felt the familiar weight of her circumstances pressing down on her shoulders. The neighborhood around her buzzed with the quiet activity of privilege. Servants hurrying between houses on errands, delivery. Boys carrying packages wrapped in brown paper. Well-dressed children walking with their governesses toward the common for their morning constitutional. Everyone here belonged. Everyone here had a place and a purpose and enough money to sleep peacefully at night. The brass doorbell gleamed like captured sunlight. Isabella reached for it 3 times before finally summoning the courage to press the button and listen to the melodic chimes echoing somewhere deep within the house. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, the sound of expensive shoes on polished floors. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair pulled into an immaculate bun and a black dress that spoke of both formality and comfort. Her eyes, sharp but not unkind, took in Isabella's appearance with the swift assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating strangers at the threshold. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying the refined pronunciation of a lifetime spent in proper society. "I'm Isabella Martinez," Isabella said, offering the calling card with slightly trembling fingers. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to call this morning." The woman, clearly the housekeeper, though her bearing suggested she held considerable authority within the household, examined the card with careful attention. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, from polite wariness to something approaching curiosity. "Ah, yes, Miss Martinez. Mr. Blackwood mentioned you might be calling. I'm Mrs. Pemberton. Please come in." The front hall took Isabella's breath away. A chandelier hung from the coffered ceiling, like a constellation of crystal and gold, casting rainbow fragments across walls lined with oil paintings of landscapes and portraits. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in one corner, its brass pendulum catching the light with each measured swing. The floors were polished hardwood, covered with Persian rugs that probably cost more than Isabella had earned in her entire life. "Mr. Blackwood is in his study," Mrs. Pemberton said, leading Isabella through the hall toward the back of the house. "He's been up since 5, reviewing correspondence from his ranch in Colorado. He rarely sleeps past dawn, I'm afraid. A habit from his years out west." They passed a formal dining room where a mahogany table could easily seat 12, a sitting room with furniture upholstered in silk brocade, and a library whose floor-to-ceiling shelves held more books than Isabella had seen outside of the public library. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and perfectly maintained, the physical manifestation of a life lived without financial constraint. Mrs. Pemberton stopped before a heavy oak door and knocked softly. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Martinez has arrived." "Come in," his voice called from within. The study was smaller than the other rooms Isabella had glimpsed, but somehow more personal. Leather-bound ledgers lined one wall, while maps of the Western Territories covered another. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warmth, and the scent of burning oak. Behind a massive desk sat Jonathan Blackwood, but this morning he looked different from the formal businessman she had met on the street. His dark hair was slightly mussed, his white shirt open at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms tanned by outdoor work. He looked younger this way, more approachable, though no less commanding. "Miss Martinez," he said, rising from his chair with a smile that reached his eyes. "I'm pleased you decided to come. I trust your accommodations were satisfactory." "More than satisfactory, sir. Thank you." "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned near the fireplace. "Mrs. Pemberton, would you mind bringing us some coffee, and perhaps those pastries from the French bakery?" As the housekeeper withdrew, Isabella settled into the chair, trying not to think about how the soft leather probably cost more than she made in several months. Jonathan moved from behind his desk to take the chair opposite hers, creating an atmosphere of conversation rather than interview. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "Several," Isabella admitted. "Then let me begin with an explanation." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. "My business interests are primarily in cattle ranching, but I also invest in various enterprises throughout the country. Recently, I've acquired a significant interest in several textile mills in Massachusetts and Connecticut." Isabella nodded, unsure where this information was leading. "The problem," he continued, "is that these mills produce excellent fabric, but they lack the finishing touches that distinguish truly fine goods from merely adequate ones. The wealthy women of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia are increasingly demanding clothing that rivals anything produced in Paris or London. Simple craftsmanship is no longer sufficient. They want artistry." Mrs. Pemberton returned with a silver service, setting delicate china cups and a plate of pastries on the small table between their chairs. The coffee smelled rich and dark, nothing like the chicory brew Isabella was accustomed to drinking when she could afford coffee at all. "What I need," Jonathan said once they were alone again, "is someone with exceptional skill to create sample garments. Pieces that demonstrate what our fabrics can become in the hands of a true artist. These samples would be used to secure contracts with the finest dress shops and department stores in major cities." Isabella accepted the coffee cup with careful hands, the china so thin she feared it might shatter at her touch. "You want me to make dresses?" "I want you to create masterpieces," he corrected. "Gowns that will make wealthy women willing to pay premium prices for our fabrics. Ball gowns, afternoon dresses, riding habits, wedding ensembles, whatever it takes to establish our reputation as the premier supplier of luxury textiles in America." The scope of what he was describing began to dawn on Isabella. This wasn't simply sewing work. This was the opportunity to design and create the kind of garments she had only dreamed of making. At Mrs. Henderson's shop, she was relegated to alterations and repairs, occasionally allowed to add embellishments to existing pieces, but never to create from her own imagination, never to work with the finest materials without concern for cost. "The compensation," Jonathan continued, "would be $200 per month, plus materials, plus lodging in a house I own on Commonwealth Avenue." Isabella nearly dropped her coffee cup. $200 was more than she made in 6 months. At the dress shop, it was more money than she had ever imagined earning in her entire life. $200, she repeated weakly, plus bonuses for exceptional work that help secure major contracts. "I believe in rewarding talent appropriately." Her mind raced with the implications. $200 a month would mean never worrying about rent again, never choosing between food and thread, never having to contemplate the desperate measures that had driven her into the streets last night. But more than that, it would mean working with silk and satin and lace without restriction, creating beautiful things without the constant pressure of penny pinching and corner cutting. "Why me?" she asked. "Surely there are established seamstresses in Boston who could do this work." Jonathan sipped his coffee thoughtfully before answering. "Established seamstresses have established methods. They know what sells, what's fashionable, what's safe. But safe doesn't create the kind of sensation that drives wealthy women to pay premium prices. I need someone hungry enough to take risks, talented enough to execute them, and unknown enough that any failures won't damage existing reputations." His honesty was both flattering and slightly unsettling. He was essentially admitting that he was gambling on her potential rather than investing in proven ability. "Also," he added with a slight smile, "last night I sent a telegram to my sister, Margaret in San Francisco. I described our encounter and asked for her professional opinion. She owns one of the most successful dress shops on the West Coast, and she has an excellent eye for talent. Isabella felt a flicker of panic. But she's never seen my work. No. But she's seen thousands of seamstresses over the years, and she says the signs I described, the calluses on your fingers, the way you examine that silk thread, the fact that you've been trusted with expensive materials despite your obvious poverty, all indicate someone with exceptional skill and absolute integrity. In her words, the bad ones never stay poor long enough to develop those particular calluses. A laugh escaped Isabella despite her nervousness. There was something both ruthless and oddly comforting about being evaluated so clinically. Of course, Jonathan continued, I'll need to see examples of your work before making any final decisions. Can you create something for me? Something that demonstrates your abilities? I don't have access to proper materials, Isabella said. Mrs. Henderson doesn't allow personal projects using shop supplies. That won't be a problem. He rose and walked to his desk, returning with a sheet of paper covered in neat handwriting. This is a list of suppliers here in the city. Purchase whatever you need. Fabric, thread, notions, tools. Everything will be charged to my accounts. Isabella stared at the list, recognizing several names as the most exclusive fabric merchants in Boston. These were places she had never dared enter, knowing that people like her were not welcome to browse among silks that cost more per yard than she made per week. What would you like me to make? She asked. Surprise me, he said. Create something that showcases your abilities and your vision. Take a week if you need it. When you're finished, bring it here and we'll discuss the position further. The enormity of the opportunity and the risk settled over Isabella like a heavy cloak. This was her chance to escape poverty, to work at the level of artistry she had always dreamed of achieving. But it was also a test that could expose her limitations, prove that her skills weren't sufficient for the kind of work he was describing. Mr. Blackwood, she said carefully, what if my work isn't good enough? What if I disappoint you? He studied her face with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Miss Martinez, yesterday you were desperate enough to approach a stranger on a dark street, willing to trade your dignity for survival. Today, you're worried about disappointing someone who's offering you the chance of a lifetime. That transformation tells me more about your character than any sample garment. Could. He paused, then added more softly, besides, I have a feeling that a woman who has survived what you've survived, who has maintained her integrity under circumstances that would break most people, is capable of far more than she realizes. Isabella felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. When had anyone last expressed such faith in her abilities? When had anyone seen potential where others saw only poverty and circumstance? I'll do my best, she said. I know you will. Jonathan returned to his desk and wrote something on a piece of letterhead, then handed it to her. This is a note to Mrs. Davidson at Davidson & Sons Fabrics. She'll provide you with anything you need. There's also the address of the house on Commonwealth Avenue. It's furnished and available immediately if you'd like to move out of wherever you're currently staying. Isabella looked at the paper in her hands. A key to possibilities she had never dared imagine. The house address was in one of the finest neighborhoods in the city, a world away from her cramped boarding house room with its broken window and shared facilities. This is too much, she said. The house, the materials, the opportunity, it's too generous. Business is never about generosity, Miss Martinez. It's about investment. I'm investing in your talent because I believe it will prove profitable for both of us. Nothing more, nothing less. But even as he spoke with the clinical detachment of a businessman, Isabella caught something in his expression that suggested his motivations might be more complex than simple profit. There was kindness there, carefully controlled, but unmistakably present. I should go, she said, rising from her chair. I have a lot of work to do. Indeed you do. He walked her to the study door, then paused. "Miss Martinez, don't try to create what you think I want to see. Create what you would want to wear if money were no object and skill were unlimited. Show me your dreams made tangible." As Mrs. Pemberton escorted her back through the grand house to the front door, Isabella's mind was already racing with possibilities. Silk that flowed like water, lace as delicate as spider webs, beadwork that caught light like captured stars. For the first time in her life, she would be limited only by her imagination rather than her circumstances. Standing once again on the brick sidewalk of Beacon Hill, Isabella Martinez looked down at the papers in her hands and realized that her life had just taken a turn as dramatic and unexpected as any in the penny novels she sometimes read by candlelight. Yesterday, she had been a desperate woman willing to trade herself for bread. Today, she was a businesswoman with unlimited access to the finest materials in Boston and the opportunity to prove that poverty had never defined her limits. Only her. Opportunities. The morning sun seemed brighter now, the city more welcoming. She had work to do, dreams to give form, and a future to create one perfect stitch at a time. The house on Commonwealth Avenue stood like a jewel among jewels, its limestone facade gleaming in the afternoon sunlight as Isabella approached with her meager possessions, clutched in a canvas bag. The street itself was a symphony of architectural elegance. 4-story brownstones with bay windows and ornate cornices, each one representing wealth that stretched back generations. Elm trees lined the sidewalks, their autumn leaves creating a golden carpet beneath her feet as she walked toward what Jonathan Blackwood had casually referred to as lodging. Number 47 bore a brass nameplate polished to mirror brightness, and when Isabella used the key he had provided, the door swung open to reveal an interior that defied every expectation she had harbored about her new circumstances. The entrance hall featured a marble floor inlaid with intricate patterns, walls covered in silk wallpaper, the color of champagne, and a crystal chandelier that cast prismatic rainbows across the ceiling. This wasn't simply lodging. This was luxury beyond anything she had ever imagined inhabiting. The furnished rooms revealed themselves like chapters in a fairy tale. A parlor with velvet upholstery and windows that overlooked the tree-lined street. A dining room with a mahogany table that could seat 8, though Isabella couldn't imagine entertaining even one guest in such grandeur. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, each more elegant than the entire boarding house where she had been living. The master bedroom contained a 4-poster bed draped in midnight blue silk, an armoire large enough to hold a dozen wardrobes, and windows that provided a view of the distant harbor where ships arrived daily carrying cargo from across the world. But it was the room on the 3rd floor that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. Jonathan had arranged for it to be converted into a seamstress's workshop that surpassed her wildest dreams. Tables of various heights provided work surfaces for cutting and assembly. Drawers and cabinets held every tool a seamstress could desire. Scissors of different sizes and purposes, measuring tapes, pincushions, thimbles, and specialized needles for every conceivable fabric. A dress form stood in one corner, adjustable to any size, while another corner held a comfortable chair positioned near the window for delicate hand sewing that required natural light. Most remarkable of all, bolts of fabric lined the walls like a textile library, silks in every conceivable color, from the palest ivory to the deepest burgundy, velvets that invited touch with their lustrous pile, satins that captured light and held it like liquid metal, laces so delicate they seemed spun from moonbeams, and woolens so fine they felt like clouds between her fingers. This wasn't just a workshop, it was a temple to the art of creating beauty from raw materials. Isabella spent her first hours in the house simply touching things, trying to convince herself that this wasn't an elaborate dream from which she would awaken to find herself back in her cramped boarding house room. She prepared tea in the fully equipped kitchen, using china that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, and carried it up to her workshop where she could plan the garment that would determine her future. Jonathan had said to surprise him to create what she would want to wear if money were no object and skill were unlimited. As she sipped tea from a porcelain cup thin enough to see through, Isabella closed her eyes and allowed her mind to wander through possibilities. What would she create if fear of failure didn't constrain her choices? What garment would showcase not just technical skill, but artistic vision? The answer came to her as she watched the afternoon light play across the bolts of fabric. An evening gown, not merely elegant, but transcendent. Something that would transform the woman wearing it into a vision of ethereal beauty. She envisioned silk the color of midnight sky, flowing like water, cut with mathematical precision to follow the body's natural lines while creating an illusion of floating grace. Over this foundation, layers of tulle so sheer they would seem like captured starlight, each layer slightly shorter than the one beneath, to create depth and movement. The bodice would be a masterpiece of engineering disguised as art, boned and fitted to provide support while appearing weightless, adorned with beadwork that traced patterns inspired by constellations. Not random sparkles, but carefully planned designs that would catch candlelight and create the impression of stars scattered across a night sky. The sleeves would be detachable, an innovation that would allow the gown to transform from formal evening wear to a more intimate dinner dress simply by changing components. For 3 days, Isabella worked with the intensity of someone possessed. She began by creating detailed sketches, calculating measurements and proportions with mathematical precision. The foundation garment came first, the silk underdress that would provide structure and color. She cut each piece with the care of a surgeon, knowing that precision in the foundation would determine the success of everything that followed. The sewing required techniques she had perfected during countless hours bent over other people's garments, but applied now to materials and designs worthy of her skill. French seams that were invisible from either side. Hand-sewn buttonholes so perfectly executed they looked like natural features of the fabric. Darts that shaped the bodice without creating bulk, creating fit that seemed effortless but required hours of careful calculation and execution. As she worked, Isabella found herself thinking about the woman who would eventually wear such a gown. In her imagination, this woman moved through ballrooms and opera houses with confidence that came not from birth or inheritance, but from the knowledge that she was wearing something unique and beautiful. The gown would give its wearer armor, made of beauty, protection crafted from artistry. The beadwork proved the most challenging aspect of the design. Isabella had chosen tiny jet beads that would create subtle texture against the midnight silk, arranged in patterns that suggested constellations without being literal representations. Each bead had to be sewn individually, secured with tiny stitches that were invisible from the right side of the garment. The work was painstaking, requiring perfect vision and steady hands. But as the patterns emerged, Isabella felt the satisfaction of watching dreams take physical form. On the 4th day, as she attached the final layer of tulle to the skirt, Jonathan Blackwood arrived unannounced. Isabella heard Mrs. Pemberton's voice in the entrance hall below, followed by masculine footsteps on the stairs. She had been so absorbed in her work that she hadn't bothered to change from her simple working dress or fix her hair, which had escaped its pins hours ago and now hung in loose waves around her shoulders. "Miss Martinez," Jonathan's voice called from the landing. "Up here," she replied, then immediately regretted it. She wasn't ready for him to see the gown. It still hung in pieces around the workshop, bodice on one dress form, skirt draped over. A chair, sleeves laid carefully on the cutting table. But it was too late. His footsteps approached, and then he was standing in the doorway of her workshop. Isabella saw him through the lens of her current surroundings and realized how dramatically the context had changed since their first meeting. Then, she had been a desperate woman in a patched dress, approaching him on a dark street. Now, she stood surrounded by the tools and materials of her trade, fabric draped around her like the accoutrements of an artist's studio. Her hands bore the stains of her work, tiny spots of silk dye and nearly invisible pricks from needles, but they were the marks of creation rather than mere survival. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said, removing his hat and gloves. "I was curious about your progress." "It's not finished," Isabella said quickly, suddenly self-conscious about the apparent chaos of her workspace. "I know it looks like chaos, but I have a system—" "It looks," Jonathan interrupted, stepping further into the room and turning slowly to take in the evidence of her work, like the workshop of someone who understands her craft. He approached the dress form where the bodice hung, studying the construction with the attention of someone who understood quality, even if he didn't understand technique. Isabella watched his face, trying to read his expression as he examined the hand-sewn seams, the intricate beadwork, the way the silk moved even without a body to give it life. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the skirt. Isabella nodded, and he lifted a section of the tulle overlay, feeling the weight and texture between his fingers. His hands, she noticed, were careful and respectful, the hands of someone who appreciated fine things without needing to possess them roughly. "The beadwork," he said, leaning closer to examine the constellation patterns. "These are actual star formations, aren't they?" Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You recognize them. Cassiopeia here, and this looks like part of Orion. Where did you learn astronomy?" "My father," she said softly. "He used to take me outside after dinner when I was small, and we would look at the stars while my mother cleaned up. He said the same stars that watched over our little village also watched over people in great cities, and that meant we were all connected somehow." Jonathan straightened, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "So a gown isn't just beautiful, it carries meaning. Everything should carry meaning," Isabella said, then immediately worried that she sounded pretentious. "I mean, when someone pays a great deal of money for a garment, they should receive more than just fabric and thread. They should receive something that makes them feel special, something that tells a story. And what story does this gown tell?" Isabella moved to the cutting table and lifted one of the detachable sleeves, holding it up so that the afternoon light caught the beadwork and made it sparkle like captured stars. "It tells the story of a woman who contains multitudes. During the day, she might be someone's daughter or wife or mother, bound by expectations and social conventions. But in the evening, wearing this gown, she becomes something more, mysterious, powerful, connected to the cosmos itself." As she spoke, Isabella realized she was describing her own transformation, the way this opportunity had allowed her to become someone she had never dared imagine being. The gown was her story made tangible, the journey from invisibility to artistry, from survival to creation. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, continuing his examination of the various pieces that would come together to form the finished garment. Finally, he looked up and met her eyes directly. "How long until it's completed?" 2 days, perhaps 3, if I want to perfect the finishing details." "Take whatever time you need. This level of artistry shouldn't be rushed." He paused, then added, "Miss Martinez, I must confess that when I offered you this opportunity, I hoped you would prove competent. I never expected to discover that you were an artist." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were so unexpectedly kind. No one had ever called her an artist before. Seamstress, worker, pair of hands, but never artist. "I should let you return to your work," Jonathan said, moving toward the door. "But before I go, I wanted to mention that I've arranged several appointments for next week. Buyers from department stores in New York and Philadelphia, the owners of exclusive dress shops here in Boston. They'll want to see what our fabrics can become when handled by someone with exceptional skill. Isabella felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. They'll be judging my work. They'll be seeing the future of American fashion, he corrected. And I have a feeling they're going to be very impressed. After he left, Isabella stood alone in her workshop, surrounded by the evidence of her transformation. The bolts of fabric seemed to glow in the afternoon light, the tools of her trade arranged with the precision of surgical instruments, the partially completed gown hanging like a promise, waiting to be fulfilled. She thought about the little girl, who had watched stars with her father, never dreaming that someday she would recreate those celestial patterns in silk and beads for wealthy women to wear to grand occasions. She thought about the desperate woman who had approached a stranger on a dark street, willing to trade dignity for survival, and she marveled at the mysterious alchemy that had transformed that woman into someone capable of creating beauty that carried meaning, garments that told stories, art that happened to be wearable. The next 3 days passed in a blur of intense focus and careful craftsmanship. Isabella completed the gown with the attention to detail of someone who understood that this single garment represented not just a job, but a future. Every stitch had to be perfect, every bead precisely placed, every seam invisible from the outside. When she finally stepped back to assess the completed work, hanging on the dress form in all its midnight glory, she felt the satisfaction of someone who had reached beyond her previous limits and discovered new possibilities. The gown was more than she had imagined when she first conceived it. The silk foundation created a silhouette that was both classical and innovative, while the layered tulle added movement and ethereal beauty. The beadwork caught light from every angle, creating the impression of wearing captured starlight. The detachable sleeves allowed for versatility that would appeal to practical-minded buyers, while maintaining the artistic integrity of the design. But more than technical excellence, the gown possessed something intangible, a presence that transformed. The corner of the workshop where it hung, looking at it, Isabella could envision the woman who would wear it stepping into a ballroom and commanding attention not through ostentation, but through the quiet confidence that came from wearing something truly exceptional. She had created more than a gown. She had created possibility itself, made tangible in midnight silk and starlight beads. And as she prepared for the meetings that would determine whether this opportunity became a lasting transformation or a brief, beautiful interlude, Isabella Martinez understood that she had already succeeded in the most important way. She had proven to herself that poverty had never defined her abilities, only her circumstances. Tomorrow would bring judgment from buyers and critics, success or disappointment, the continuation of this new life or a return to desperation. But tonight, standing in her workshop surrounded by the tools of artistry and the evidence of her capabilities, Isabella allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten existed: pride in work well done and hope for what might come next. The drawing room at the Blackwood Mansion had been transformed into a showroom that rivaled the finest galleries in Boston. Morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the midnight gown that hung on a professional mannequin. Like a captured piece of night sky, Isabella stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped to stop their trembling, wearing a dress Jonathan had insisted she have made for the occasion. Deep forest green wool with subtle embroidery at the cuffs and collar, elegant enough to command respect without overshadowing her creation. The buyers began arriving promptly at 10 o'clock, each one representing a different aspect of America's growing luxury market. Mrs. Victoria Ashford from Ashford and Company in New York swept in, wearing a burgundy traveling dress that probably cost more than most people's annual wages. Her sharp eyes immediately assessing everything, from the room's appointments to Isabella's appearance. She was followed by Mr. Henri Dubois from the exclusive Maison Dubois in Philadelphia, a man whose French accent and impeccable tailoring spoke of European training and American ambition. The most intimidating presence, however, was Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, owner of Whitmore's Fine Fashions here in Boston, a woman whose approval could make or break a designer's reputation in New England society. She entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, her steel-grey hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that defied gravity, her black silk dress adorned with jet beading that caught the light. With every movement, Jonathan moved among his guests with the easy confidence of a practiced host, offering coffee and pastries while guiding conversation toward business matters. Isabella noticed how he positioned himself, always within sight of her, ready to step in if the dynamics became uncomfortable, but allowing her to be the focus of attention. It was a delicate balance between protection and empowerment that spoke volumes about his understanding of both business and human nature. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, as the last guest accepted refreshment, "thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to see something truly exceptional. What you're about to witness represents the future of American fashion, artistry, that rivals anything produced in Europe, created using the finest fabrics available anywhere in the world." Mrs. Ashford adjusted her spectacles and moved closer to the gown, her expression skeptical. "Mr. Blackwood, we've seen many promising young seamstresses over the years. What makes this one different?" Before Jonathan could respond, Isabella stepped forward. The weeks of luxury and encouragement had rebuilt her confidence, but more importantly, they had reminded her that her voice mattered, that her vision had value beyond mere technical execution. "Perhaps," Isabella said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "you should judge for yourself." She moved to the mannequin and began explaining the gown's construction, but not in the apologetic tones of someone seeking approval. Instead, she spoke with the authority of an artist discussing her work. She pointed out the mathematical precision of the fit, the innovation of the detachable sleeves, the way the layered tulle created movement that would make the wearer appear to float across a ballroom floor. "The beadwork," she continued, indicating the constellation patterns that spiraled across the bodice, tells a story. Each design represents actual star formations, connecting the wearer to something larger than fashion, larger than the immediate social occasion. This gown doesn't simply make a woman beautiful, it makes her memorable. Mr. Dubois circled the mannequin slowly, his trained eye examining seams and construction details. "The technical execution is flawless," he admitted. "But technique alone doesn't sell gowns in Philadelphia society. What matters is whether the design creates desire." "Then perhaps," Mrs. Whitmore interjected with the sharp tone of someone accustomed to being the final authority, "we should see it worn rather than displayed in a lifeless form." Isabella felt her confidence waver. She hadn't anticipated this request, hadn't prepared for the possibility that the buyers would want to see the gown in motion. The mannequin showcased the construction beautifully, but fashion was ultimately about transformation, how a garment changed the woman wearing it. "Of course," Jonathan said smoothly. "Miss Martinez, would you be willing to model your creation?" The request hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella realized that this moment would define not just the success of this particular business venture, but her own understanding of who she had become. 3 weeks ago, she had been invisible, desperate, willing to trade dignity for survival. Now she was being asked to step literally and figuratively into the role of someone worthy of wearing art. "I'll need a few minutes to change," she said. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been standing discreetly near the door, stepped forward with perfect timing. "Of course, miss, I'll assist you." In the guest bedroom that had been designated as a dressing room, Isabella allowed the housekeeper to help her out of the green wool dress and into the gown she had created. The silk felt cool against her skin, the fitted bodice providing support, while the flowing skirt created the illusion of weightlessness. Mrs. Pemberton fastened the tiny buttons that ran up the back, each one hand-covered in matching silk, and attached the detachable sleeves with movements that spoke of years spent, helping wealthy women prepare for important occasions. "You look," Mrs. Pemberton said softly as she made final adjustments to the drape of the tulle overlays, "like you were born to wear such things." Isabella studied her reflection in the full-length mirror and hardly recognized the woman looking back at her. The gown had transformed her completely, not through artifice or illusion, but by revealing qualities that had always existed beneath the surface. The midnight silk complemented her olive complexion, while the constellation beadwork drew attention to the graceful line of her neck and shoulders. The flowing skirt made her appear taller, more regal, while the innovative design elements showcased intelligence as well as beauty. More than physical transformation, however, the gown gave her something invaluable, the confidence that came from wearing something created by her own hands, designed according to her own vision, executed with skills she had developed through years of dedication to her craft. This wasn't borrowed finery that would eventually be returned to its rightful owner. This was her creation, her achievement, her proof that artistry could lift someone beyond the circumstances of their birth. When she returned to the drawing room, the conversation stopped entirely. Mrs. Ashford removed her spectacles and cleaned them carefully, as if doubting what she was seeing. Mr. Dubois set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink against china. Even Mrs. Whitmore, accustomed to evaluating the finest fashions available in Boston society, stared with an expression that revealed genuine surprise. But it was Jonathan's reaction that affected Isabella most profoundly. His dark eyes widened slightly, and something in his expression shifted from professional appreciation to personal recognition. He was seeing her not just as a talented employee or a promising business investment, but as a woman worthy of admiration in her own right. "Walk," Mrs. Whitmore commanded, her voice softer than before but carrying unmistakable authority. Isabella moved across the room with steps measured to showcase the gown's movement. The tulle layers flowed like water, the beadwork caught light from the windows and fireplace, creating the impression of stars shifting across a night sky. The detachable sleeves added elegance to her arm movements, while the perfectly fitted bodice allowed her to move with natural grace rather than the restricted steps required by poorly constructed garments. "Turn," Mrs. Ashford said, and Isabella complied, demonstrating how the gown looked from every angle, how the back construction was as beautiful as the front, how the train created a graceful line without being cumbersome. When she finally stopped near the fireplace, the room remained silent for a long moment. Isabella could hear her own heartbeat, the distant sounds of Boston traffic, the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Everything else had been suspended while these arbiters of fashion processed what they had witnessed. "Where did you train?" Mr. Dubois asked finally. "I didn't," Isabella replied honestly. "I learned from necessity, working in dress shops and taking in private alterations." "Impossible," Mrs. Whitmore said flatly. "This level of sophistication requires formal education, European training. You can't simply develop such skills in isolation." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being believed. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your skepticism, but sometimes exceptional talent emerges from unexpected circumstances. Miss Martinez has created something that transcends traditional training. She's created art." Mrs. Ashford was examining the gown's construction details with the intense focus of someone calculating profit margins. The materials alone must have cost a fortune. What would be the production price for something like this? That depends, Isabella said, finding her voice again, on whether you want to reproduce this exact design or create variations that showcase the same level of artistry. This gown was designed as a showpiece, but the techniques could be adapted for different price points while maintaining the quality and innovation that make it special. The business discussion that followed was unlike anything Isabella had ever experienced. Instead of being talked about as if she weren't present, she found herself at the center of negotiations about pricing, production schedules, and exclusive arrangements. The buyers weren't just interested in purchasing finished garments. They wanted access to her designs, her techniques, her artistic vision. Mrs. Whitmore, who had seemed the most skeptical initially, proved to be the most aggressive in her proposals. "I want exclusive rights to your designs for the Boston market," she declared. "Whatever Mr. Blackwood is paying you, I'll double it. You could have your own department in my store, your own line of signature pieces." "With respect, Mrs. Whitmore," Mr. Dubois interjected, "Philadelphia society would provide a much more appreciative audience for such artistry. Our customers understand the value of true innovation." The competing offers created a surreal atmosphere, as these powerful business people bid for access to talents that Isabella had nearly traded for bread just weeks earlier. But throughout the negotiations, she noticed Jonathan's careful silence. He participated in discussions about logistics and pricing, but he never pressured her toward any particular decision, never used his position as her current patron to influence her choices. It was Mrs. Ashford who cut through the competing proposals with characteristic directness. "Miss Martinez, what do you want? These gentlemen are talking about what they can offer you, but what do you want to achieve with your work?" The question caught Isabella off guard. Throughout her life, want had been a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival had dictated every decision. Necessity had determined every choice. But now, standing in a room where her artistry was being treated as a valuable commodity, she found herself contemplating desires that went beyond mere financial security. "I want," she said slowly, feeling her way through thoughts she had never been free to express, "to create beautiful things that make women feel powerful. I want my work to tell stories, to carry meaning beyond mere fashion. And I want to build something lasting, not just a job, but a legacy." The honesty of her response seemed to surprise even her questioners. Mrs. Whitmore nodded approvingly, while Mr. Dubois smiled with what appeared to be genuine respect. "In that case," Jonathan said, speaking for the first time since the bidding had begun, "perhaps we should discuss a different kind of arrangement entirely." He moved to his desk and returned with several documents that appeared to have been prepared in advance. "I propose that Miss Martinez become a partner in a new enterprise, Constellation Couture. She would maintain creative control over all designs while we handle production, marketing, and distribution. The profits would be shared equally, and she would retain ownership of her artistic vision." Isabella stared at the papers in his outstretched hand, seeing terms and conditions that represented more than financial opportunity. They represented respect for her artistry, recognition of her value as more than skilled labor. "A partnership," she repeated. "Between equals," Jonathan confirmed. "Your creativity, my business infrastructure, your artistic vision, my connections and capital. Together, we could create something that changes how America thinks about fashion." The competing buyers exchanged glances that spoke of frustrated opportunity, but Mrs. Whitmore, ever the pragmatist, smiled with grudging admiration. "A wise move. Mr. Blackwood, I suppose we'll have to settle for being your first major customers rather than your partners." As the meeting concluded with handshakes and preliminary orders that represented more money than Isabella had ever imagined earning, she remained in the midnight gown that had transformed her life. The beadwork caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and she thought about the constellation patterns that had connected her to memories of stargazing with her father, to dreams of creating beauty that carried meaning. But standing in Jonathan's drawing room, surrounded by the evidence of her success and the promise of an unprecedented partnership, Isabella realized that the most profound transformation hadn't been in her circumstances. It had been in her understanding of her own worth. She was no longer a desperate woman willing to trade dignity for survival. She was an artist, a businesswoman, a creator of beauty that could change how people saw themselves and their place in the world. The poor seamstress who had approached a stranger on a dark street still existed within her, but she had been joined by someone new, someone who wore midnight silk and starlight beads, not as borrowed finery, but as the natural expression of talents that had always existed, waiting for the right opportunity to shine. Winter descended upon Boston with unusual ferocity, blanketing the city in snow that transformed the elegant brownstones of Commonwealth Avenue into a wonderland of crystal and ice. From her workshop window, Isabella watched the world turn white while her fingers worked steadily on the latest commission. A wedding gown for the daughter of a railroad magnate, commissioned at a price that would have supported her for 2 years in her previous life. 3 months had passed since the presentation that changed everything. Constellation Couture had become the most sought-after name in American high fashion, with orders pouring in from New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and even San Francisco. Isabella's designs graced the pages of Harper's Bazaar and Godey's Ladies, book photographed on society women whose names appeared regularly in newspaper social columns. The desperate seamstress, who had once considered trading herself for bread, had become Isabella Martinez, celebrated artist and successful businesswoman. But success, she had discovered, brought complications she had never anticipated. The relationship between her and Jonathan had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. They were business partners, certainly, equal stakeholders in an enterprise that generated more profit each month than either had initially projected. They were friends, collaborating daily on decisions about designs, materials, and business strategy. Yet beneath these defined roles simmered something unspoken, a tension that grew stronger with each shared glance across the conference table, each casual brush of fingers when reviewing contracts. Each evening they worked late and found themselves alone in his study, discussing plans for expanding their operations. The problem was Mrs. Caroline Ashworth. She appeared in Jonathan's life 6 weeks ago, arriving in Boston as the representative of her family's banking interests in New York. Tall, blonde, and possessed of the kind of aristocratic beauty that graced the society pages, Caroline moved through Boston's elite circles with the confidence of someone born to wealth and privilege. More troubling still, she seemed genuinely attracted to Jonathan, and he appeared to reciprocate her interest. Isabella first became aware of Caroline's presence when she arrived at the Beacon Hill mansion for their regular Tuesday meeting to find a woman's fur coat draped over the chair in the front hall. Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned quietly that Mr. Blackwood was entertaining a guest, and perhaps Miss Martinez might prefer to reschedule their appointment. The rational part of Isabella's mind acknowledged that Jonathan was free to entertain whoever he chose. Their partnership agreement contained no personal clauses, no expectations beyond professional collaboration. He was a wealthy, unmarried man in his 30s. Naturally, he would attract female attention from women of his own social class, women who shared his background, his education, his familiarity with society's expectations. But rationality provided little comfort when Isabella found herself lying awake at night, imagining Jonathan and Caroline attending Boston's finest social events together. Caroline would wear gowns created by established fashion houses, diamonds that had been in her family for generations, and the unconscious confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. She would be everything Isabella could never be, no matter how successful Constellation Couture became. The irony was particularly cruel. Isabella's designs had elevated her to professional heights she had never dreamed possible, but personal. Happiness seemed to retreat further with each social milestone she achieved. Success had given her financial security, artistic recognition, and business independence, everything except the one thing that mattered most. The realization that she had fallen in love with Jonathan came gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape she thought she knew. It began with small moments. The way he listened when she explained a design concept, his habit of bringing her coffee without being asked during long working sessions, the pride in his voice when he spoke about her achievements to potential clients. She found herself looking forward to their meetings not just for professional reasons, but for the simple pleasure of being in his presence. But love, Isabella discovered, was a luxury even more dangerous than hope. It made her vulnerable in ways that poverty never had, created needs that money couldn't satisfy and success couldn't fill. The crisis came on a particularly brutal February evening, when a nor'easter had buried Boston under 3 feet of snow. Isabella had been working late in her Commonwealth Avenue workshop, putting finishing touches on a ball gown that needed to be delivered the following morning despite the weather. The commission was for Mrs. Theodore Cabot, one of Boston's most influential society matrons, and punctuality mattered more than personal comfort. As she carefully hand-sewed the final beads onto the gown's elaborate train, Isabella heard the front door open and close, followed by voices in the entrance hall. She recognized Jonathan's deep tones immediately, but the feminine laughter that accompanied them made her stomach clench with unwelcome jealousy. "Absolutely impossible to get a carriage in this weather," Caroline's voice drifted up from below, cultured and melodious. "I'm so grateful you offered to escort me home." Isabella set down her needle and moved quietly to the top of the stairs, where she could hear the conversation without being seen. She told herself she was simply being cautious, ensuring that her late-night work wouldn't disturb Jonathan's guest, but honesty compelled her to admit she was eavesdropping. "I couldn't leave you stranded at the hotel," Jonathan replied. "Though I'm afraid you'll have to wait out the storm here. The streets are completely impassable." "How terrible," Caroline said with laughter that suggested she found the prospect anything but unpleasant. "I suppose we'll have to make the best of it." Isabella retreated to her workshop, but concentration proved impossible. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the drawing room below, punctuated by Caroline's frequent laughter. They discussed mutual acquaintances, upcoming social events, and investment opportunities that connected their respective family interests. It was the easy conversation of equals, people who shared references and assumptions that came from similar backgrounds. Around midnight, the conversation grew quieter, more intimate. Isabella found herself straining to hear, hating herself for the weakness, but unable to resist, when she caught the sound of Caroline's voice saying, "Jonathan, you must know how I feel about you." Isabella felt something break inside her chest. His response was too quiet to distinguish, but Caroline's delighted laughter suggested it had been favorable. Isabella closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cold window glass, watching snowflakes swirl in the darkness, while her heart seemed to crumble like poorly sewn seams. She forced herself to return to the ball gown, using work as an anesthetic for pain that cut deeper than any physical wound. The repetitive motion of sewing helped calm her racing thoughts, while the familiar weight of silk and beads in her hands reminded her of accomplishments that existed independent of romantic disappointment. It was nearly dawn when she finally finished the gown, and the house had been silent for hours. Isabella packed the dress carefully in tissue paper and prepared to brave the storm for delivery, grateful for any excuse to leave before Jonathan and Caroline emerged from whatever intimacy the night had brought. But as she crept down the stairs, with her bundle, she found Jonathan sitting alone in the drawing room, still fully dressed, staring into the dying embers of the fire with an expression she couldn't read. He looked up as she appeared in the doorway, his dark eyes reflecting exhaustion and something that might have been confusion. "Isabella," he said, rising from his chair, "what are you doing so early?" "The Cabot Commission," she replied, lifting. "The package. It needs to be delivered this morning regardless of the weather." "In this storm? That's completely unnecessary. Mrs. Cabot will understand if the delivery is delayed." "I made a commitment," Isabella said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Mrs. Cabot is hosting a charity ball tonight, and she's counting on wearing this gown. I won't disappoint a client because of personal inconvenience." Jonathan studied her face with the intensity that always made her feel exposed. Personal inconvenience? Isabella realized she had revealed more than intended. "The weather," she clarified weakly. "Ah." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Caroline left hours ago. One of her family's drivers managed to get through with a sleigh. The information should have provided relief, but instead it left Isabella feeling foolish for the assumptions she had made." "I see." "Do you?" Jonathan asked, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him directly. "I'm not sure what you mean." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his usually perfect appearance had been disheveled by a sleepless night. "Isabella, what do you see when you look at Caroline Ashworth?" The question caught her, completely off guard. "I see a beautiful, accomplished woman from your social sphere who would make you an appropriate wife." Jonathan's laugh was sharp, entirely without humor. "Appropriate, yes, Caroline would be very appropriate indeed. We have the same background, the same social connections, the same expectations about how life should unfold. Our families have known each other for generations. Our financial interests align perfectly, and society would applaud such a union." Isabella felt each word like a separate wound. "Then you're fortunate to have found such perfect compatibility." "Perfect compatibility," he repeated. And yet, when she spoke of her feelings last night, when she made it clear that marriage would be welcome, all I could think about was how wrong it felt. Isabella's heart began beating so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. Wrong? Wrong, because she isn't you. The words hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse entirely. Isabella stared at him, searching his face for signs that she had misunderstood, that exhaustion had made him speak carelessly. "Jonathan," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know all the reasons why it's impossible," he said. "I know that society would never accept a relationship between a man of my background and a woman of yours, no matter how successful you become. I know that Caroline represents everything logical and appropriate, while you represent everything dangerous and complicated." Each word should have built walls between them, but instead, Isabella felt barriers dissolving. And yet you're the one I think about when I wake up each morning. You're the one whose opinion matters when I make business decisions. You're the one who makes me believe that two people can create something together that's greater than what either could achieve alone. Isabella set down the package containing Mrs. Cabot's gown, her hands suddenly too unsteady to maintain their grip. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between offering you a job and watching you transform into the most remarkable woman I've ever known, I fell completely, irrevocably in love with you." The confession hit Isabella like a physical force. knocking the breath from her lungs and making her knees weak. She had dreamed of hearing such words from him, but had never believed they could be real. But Caroline is everything. I thought I wanted in a wife when I was a young man who believed that appropriate choices led to happiness. You're everything I actually need as a man who has learned that happiness comes from connecting with someone who sees the world the way you do, who challenges you to become better than you thought possible. Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying so hard not to, trying to convince myself that partnership was enough, that friendship was sufficient. But I love you so much it terrifies me." Jonathan crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 quick strides, taking her face gently between his hands. "Then marry me," he said, "not because it makes sense to anyone else, but because it makes sense to us." Isabella looked into his eyes and saw her own transformation reflected there, the journey from desperation to hope, from survival to success, from isolation to love. The obstacles that stood between them were real and formidable. Society would indeed disapprove of their union. Caroline's family connections could create business complications. The differences in their backgrounds would require constant navigation. But looking at Jonathan, Isabella realized that they had already overcome the greatest obstacle of all, the belief that they weren't worthy of love, that happiness was a luxury beyond their reach. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like the most natural thing she had ever spoken. When he kissed her, with snow still falling outside and dawn beginning to paint the sky pink and gold, Isabella understood that this was the completion of her transformation. She had begun as a poor seamstress, willing to trade herself for bread, had become a successful artist, creating beauty for others, and now she was simply a woman in love with a man who saw her true worth. The silk gowns and beaded masterpieces would continue, the business would flourish, and society would eventually accept what love had already decided. But standing in Jonathan's arms, while Boston awakened to a world made new by snow, Isabella knew that the greatest thing she had ever created wasn't a gown or a business. It was a life built on the radical proposition that love could indeed conquer all, one perfect stitch at a time. Spring arrived in Boston with an explosion of cherry blossoms that lined Commonwealth Avenue like nature's own wedding decorations, their pink petals drifting on warm breezes that carried the promise of new beginnings. From the window of her expanded workshop, now occupying the entire 3rd floor of a building Jonathan had purchased specifically for Constellation Couture, Isabella watched the world bloom while putting the finishing touches on the most important garment she would ever create, her own wedding dress. "Absolutely impossible to get a carriage in this weather," Caroline's voice drifted up from below, cultured and melodious. "I'm so grateful you offered to escort me home." Isabella set down her needle and moved quietly to the top of the stairs, where she could hear the conversation without being seen. She told herself she was simply being cautious, ensuring that her late-night work wouldn't disturb Jonathan's guest, but honesty compelled her to admit she was eavesdropping. "I couldn't leave you stranded at the hotel," Jonathan replied. "Though I'm afraid you'll have to wait out the storm here. The streets are completely impassable." "How terrible," Caroline said with laughter that suggested she found the prospect anything but unpleasant. "I suppose we'll have to make the best of it." Isabella retreated to her workshop, but concentration proved impossible. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the drawing room below, punctuated by Caroline's frequent laughter. They discussed mutual acquaintances, upcoming social events, and investment opportunities that connected. their respective family interests. It was the easy conversation of equals, people who shared references and assumptions that came from similar backgrounds. Around midnight, the conversation grew quieter, more intimate. Isabella found herself straining to hear, hating herself for the weakness, but unable to resist, when she caught the sound of Caroline's voice saying, "Jonathan, you must know how I feel about you." Isabella felt something break inside her chest. His response was too quiet to distinguish, but Caroline's delighted laughter suggested it had been favorable. Isabella closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cold window glass, watching snowflakes swirl in the darkness, while her heart seemed to crumble like poorly sewn seams. She forced herself to return to the ball gown, using work as an anesthetic for pain that cut deeper than any physical wound. The repetitive motion of sewing helped calm her racing thoughts, while the familiar weight of silk and beads in her hands reminded her of accomplishments that existed independent of romantic disappointment. It was nearly dawn when she finally finished the gown, and the house had been silent for hours. Isabella packed the dress carefully in tissue paper and prepared to brave the storm for delivery, grateful for any excuse to leave before Jonathan and Caroline emerged from whatever intimacy the night had brought. But as she crept down the stairs, with her bundle, she found Jonathan sitting alone in the drawing room, still fully dressed, staring into the dying embers of the fire with an expression she couldn't read. He looked up as she appeared in the doorway, his dark eyes reflecting exhaustion and something that might have been confusion. "Isabella," he said, rising from his chair, "what are you doing so early?" "The Cabot Commission," she replied, lifting. "The package. It needs to be delivered this morning regardless of the weather." "In this storm? That's completely unnecessary. Mrs. Cabot will understand if the delivery is delayed." "I made a commitment," Isabella said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Mrs. Cabot is hosting a charity ball tonight, and she's counting on wearing this gown. I won't disappoint a client because of personal inconvenience." Jonathan studied her face with the intensity that always made her feel exposed. Personal inconvenience? Isabella realized she had revealed more than intended. "The weather," she clarified weakly. "Ah." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Caroline left hours ago. One of her family's drivers managed to get through with a sleigh. The information should have provided relief, but instead it left Isabella feeling foolish for the assumptions she had made." "I see." "Do you?" Jonathan asked, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him directly. "I'm not sure what you mean." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his usually perfect appearance had been disheveled by a sleepless night. "Isabella, what do you see when you look at Caroline Ashworth?" The question caught her, completely off guard. "I see a beautiful, accomplished woman from your social sphere who would make you an appropriate wife." Jonathan's laugh was sharp, entirely without humor. "Appropriate, yes, Caroline would be very appropriate indeed. We have the same background, the same social connections, the same expectations about how life should unfold. Our families have known each other for generations. Our financial interests align perfectly, and society would applaud such a union." Isabella felt each word like a separate wound. "Then you're fortunate to have found such perfect compatibility." "Perfect compatibility," he repeated. And yet, when she spoke of her feelings last night, when she made it clear that marriage would be welcome, all I could think about was how wrong it felt. Isabella's heart began beating so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Wrong? Wrong, because she isn't you." The words hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse entirely. Isabella stared at him, searching his face for signs that she had misunderstood, that exhaustion had made him speak carelessly. "Jonathan," she began, But he held up a hand to stop her. "I know all the reasons why it's impossible," he said. "I know that society would never accept a relationship between a man of my background and a woman of yours, no matter how successful you become. I know that Caroline represents everything logical and appropriate, while you represent everything dangerous and complicated." Each word should have built walls between them, but instead, Isabella felt barriers dissolving. And yet you're the one I think about when I wake up each morning. You're the one whose opinion matters when I make business decisions. You're the one who makes me believe that two people can create something together that's greater than what either could achieve alone. Isabella set down the package containing Mrs. Cabot's gown, her hands suddenly too unsteady to maintain their grip. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between offering you a job and watching you transform into the most remarkable woman I've ever known, I fell completely, irrevocably in love with you." The confession hit Isabella like a physical force, knocking the breath from her lungs and making her knees weak. She had dreamed of hearing such words from him, but had never believed they could be real. But Caroline is everything I thought I wanted in a wife when I was a young man who believed that appropriate choices led to happiness. You're everything I actually need as a man who has learned that happiness comes from connecting with someone who sees the world the way you do, who challenges you to become better than you thought possible. Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying so hard not to, trying to convince myself that partnership was enough, that friendship was sufficient. But I love you so much it terrifies me." Jonathan crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 quick strides, taking her face gently between his hands. "Then marry me," he said, "not because it makes sense to anyone else, but because it makes sense to us." Isabella looked into his eyes and saw her own transformation reflected there, the journey from desperation to hope, from survival to success, from isolation to love. The obstacles that stood between them were real and formidable. Society would indeed disapprove of their union. Caroline's family connections could create business complications. The differences in their backgrounds would require constant navigation. But looking at Jonathan, Isabella realized that they had already overcome the greatest obstacle of all, the belief that they weren't worthy of love, that happiness was a luxury beyond their reach. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like the most natural thing she had ever spoken. When he kissed her, with snow still falling outside and dawn beginning to paint the sky pink and gold, Isabella understood that this was the completion of her transformation. She had begun as a poor seamstress willing to trade herself for bread, had become a successful artist creating beauty for others, and now she was simply a woman in love with a man who saw her true worth. The silk gowns and beaded masterpieces would continue, the business would flourish, and society would eventually accept what love had already decided. But standing in Jonathan's arms, while Boston awakened to a world made new by snow, Isabella knew that the greatest thing she had ever created wasn't a gown or a business. It was a life built on the radical proposition that love could indeed conquer all, one perfect stitch at a time. Spring arrived in Boston with an explosion of cherry blossoms that lined Commonwealth Avenue like nature's own wedding decorations, their pink petals drifting on warm breezes that carried the promise of new beginnings. From the window of her expanded workshop, now occupying the entire 3rd floor of a building Jonathan had purchased specifically for Constellation Couture, Isabella watched the world bloom while putting the finishing touches on the most important garment she would ever create, her own wedding dress. The announcement of their engagement had sent shockwaves through Boston society that continued to reverberate 6 months later. The newspapers had covered the story with a mixture of fascination and scandal. "Cattle baron to wed his seamstress," proclaimed the Boston Herald, while the more refined Atlantic Monthly published a lengthy article about the rise of new money democracy in American high society. Some coverage was sympathetic, praising Isabella's remarkable transformation from poverty to prominence, while other commentary was distinctly less charitable, questioning whether nouveau riche industrialists were destroying the fabric of proper society. The reaction from Boston's established families ranged from cautious acceptance to outright hostility. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, whose fashion empire had benefited enormously from selling Isabella's designs, publicly declared her support for the union, stating that true aristocracy comes from excellence of character rather than accidents of birth. But others, led by the formidable Mrs. Theodore Cabot, organized a subtle but effective campaign of social exclusion, ensuring that certain invitations were not extended and particular doors remained firmly closed. Caroline Ashworth had departed Boston immediately after the engagement announcement, but not before making her feelings known in a letter to Jonathan that he had shared with Isabella in the interest of complete honesty. The letter, written in Caroline's elegant script on cream-colored paper, embossed with her family crest, expressed shock and disappointment in language that managed to be both perfectly polite and thoroughly cutting. "While I respect your right to make whatever personal choices you deem appropriate," Caroline had written, "I cannot help but feel that you are throwing away everything your family worked to build for the sake of what can only be described as an infatuation with someone entirely unsuitable to your position in society. I hope you will reconsider before irreparably damaging both your reputation and your business prospects." The letter's thinly veiled threats proved prescient. Several of Jonathan's business associates, particularly those with connections to Caroline's family banking interests, began withdrawing their support from his various enterprises. Loan renewals were denied without explanation, investment opportunities mysteriously evaporated, and social connections that had once opened doors now seemed to create barriers instead. But for every door that closed, another opened. The publicity surrounding their unconventional romance had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Progressive businessmen who admired Jonathan's willingness to challenge social conventions sought him out as a partner. Magazine editors, fascinated by Isabella's story, commissioned articles about her designs and her journey from poverty to prominence. Most surprisingly, orders for Constellation couture gowns increased dramatically, as women across the country expressed interest in wearing designs created by someone who understood transformation from personal experience. The workshop that had once been Isabella's solitary domain now bustled with activity. She had hired 12 seamstresses, carefully selected not just for their technical skills, but for their dedication to the artistry that set Constellation couture apart from mere commercial fashion. Each woman worked at stations equipped with the finest tools and materials, creating garments that bore Isabella's designs but carried the individual touches that came from skilled hands interpreting artistic vision. Among her employees was Maria Santos, a young woman whose circumstances reminded Isabella painfully of her own earlier desperation. Maria had appeared at the workshop 6 weeks ago, asking for any kind of work, even cleaning or organizing supplies. She was obviously undernourished, her clothes patched and mended multiple times, but her eyes held the spark of someone who refused to surrender hope entirely. When Isabella examined Maria's needlework, samples she carried in a small portfolio made from cardboard and string, she recognized talent that transcended formal training. The stitches were precise despite being sewn by candlelight, the repairs invisible despite being made with mismatched thread. Most tellingly, Maria had attempted original designs on scraps of fabric, creating beauty from materials others would have discarded as worthless. "How long since you've eaten a proper meal?" Isabella had asked, recognizing the signs she had once seen in her own mirror. "I'm fine, miss," Maria had replied with the pride that came from maintaining dignity in desperate circumstances. Isabella smiled at the familiar deflection. "I asked how long, not how you feel." 3 days, Maria admitted quietly. That afternoon, Isabella had taken Maria to a restaurant and watched her try to eat slowly despite obvious hunger, just as Isabella herself had done during that first meal. Jonathan had provided. Then she offered Maria not just employment, but training in the advanced techniques that would allow her talent to flourish fully. "Why?" Maria had asked, echoing the question Isabella had once posed to Jonathan. "Because everyone deserves the chance to become who they're meant to be," Isabella had replied. "And because I know what it's like to believe that circumstances define limitations rather than merely presenting challenges." Now, as Isabella worked on the final details of her wedding dress, she could hear Maria's voice among the others in the workshop below, asking questions and offering suggestions with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. The sound filled Isabella with satisfaction that went beyond business success. She was creating opportunities for other women to discover their own potential, just as Jonathan had done for her. The wedding dress itself represented everything. Isabella had learned about the relationship between artistry and meaning. The foundation was silk, the color of morning light, cut and fitted to follow her body's natural lines, while creating a silhouette that was both classical and innovative. Over this base, she had layered panels of the finest Belgian lace, each piece hand-sewn with stitches so small they were virtually invisible. The overall effect was ethereal without being impractical, elegant without being ostentatious. But the true artistry lay in the details that told the story of their love. Embroidered along the hem in thread that matched the silk exactly were constellations, not random star patterns, but the specific formations that had been visible on the night Jonathan first offered her hope. The bodice featured tiny pearl buttons, each one carved with a different flower that grew wild in the Colorado territories where Jonathan's ranch operated. The veil, which would be secured with a comb that had belonged to his mother, was edged with lace that Isabella had designed to incorporate motifs from both her Spanish heritage and his Irish ancestry. Every element of the dress carried significance that transformed it from mere wedding attire into a wearable autobiography of their journey together. When she wore it, Isabella would carry the story of how a desperate seamstress and a lonely rancher had found in each other the courage to choose love over convention, artistry over safety, possibility over certainty. The wedding itself had required careful planning to navigate the social complexities their union represented. They had considered eloping, avoiding the scrutiny and potential humiliation of a public ceremony. But Jonathan had argued persuasively that hiding their marriage would validate the critics who claimed their love was something shameful, something that couldn't withstand public examination. "If we're going to challenge society's assumptions," he had said, "we should do it openly, proudly, and with enough style to make them reconsider their prejudices." St. Paul's Cathedral had been chosen as the venue, its soaring architecture providing a setting grand enough to command respect, while its progressive rector, Father Michael O'Sullivan, had agreed to perform the ceremony despite pressure from some parishioners to refuse. The guest list represented a careful balance. Business associates who supported their union, family friends who had remained loyal despite social pressure, and a selection of clients whose attendance would demonstrate that Constellation Couture's success transcended any personal controversy. Jonathan's sister Margaret had traveled from San Francisco specifically for the wedding. bringing with her a dress made from one of Isabella's designs and a letter of support from prominent West Coast society figures who admired Isabella's achievements. Mrs. Pemberton had taken charge of reception planning with the efficiency of a military commander, ensuring that every detail reflected the couple's status while subtly thumbing their noses at critics who suggested the event would be anything less than magnificent. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, with sunshine that made the stained glass windows of St. Paul's glow like jewels. Isabella woke in the Commonwealth Avenue house that had been her refuge and workshop, but which she would leave that evening as Mrs. Jonathan Blackwood, mistress of a Beacon Hill mansion and partner in an enterprise that was reshaping American fashion. As Maria and two other seamstresses helped her into the wedding dress, Isabella thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she had stood in Quincy Market with 3 pennies in her palm, willing to trade her dignity for survival. Today, she was preparing to marry a man who saw her as an equal partner in every sense, who had supported her transformation, from desperate employee to successful artist to beloved woman. The dress fit perfectly, as she had known it would. The morning light streaming through the workshop windows caught the pearl buttons and made them glow like captured stars, while the lace overlay created patterns of shadow and brilliance that shifted with every movement. In the full-length mirror, Isabella saw not just a bride, but the culmination of every dream she had ever dared to harbor about becoming someone worthy of love and respect. "You look like a queen," Maria whispered, her eyes bright with tears of happiness for the woman who had given her own life a new direction. "I look like myself," Isabella replied, and realized that this was the greatest transformation of all. She had learned to see her own worth clearly, without the distortion of poverty or the false humility that came from believing she didn't deserve good things. The ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral unfolded like a scene from a fairy tale, but one grounded in genuine emotion rather than fantasy. The pews were filled with guests who represented every aspect of their shared life: business partners, employees, social allies, and the few family members who remained supportive despite the unconventional match. Isabella walked down the aisle, on the arm of Mr. Henri Dubois, who had offered to give her away when she mentioned having no male relatives in Boston, and who declared himself honored to participate in the wedding of the century. But none of the pageantry mattered as much as the moment when Isabella reached the altar and saw Jonathan waiting for her. He wore a formal morning dress that emphasized his tall frame and broad shoulders, but it was his expression that took her breath away, wonder, joy, and a love so profound it seemed to illuminate the entire cathedral. When he took her hand, Isabella felt the completion of a circle that had begun in desperation and culminated in a happiness she had never believed possible. Father O'Sullivan's words seemed to resonate with special meaning as he spoke about the sacred nature of marriage between two people who chose to build a life together based on mutual respect, shared dreams, and unwavering commitment. When the moment came for vows, Isabella and Jonathan had written their own words that spoke directly to their unique journey. "Isabella," Jonathan said, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted space, "you came into my life when I had forgotten that business success means nothing without someone to share it with. You taught me that true partnership requires not just compatible goals, but compatible souls. I promise to support your dreams as enthusiastically as you have supported mine, to face whatever challenges society may present us, and to love you not despite your remarkable strength, but because of it." Isabella's response came from the heart that had learned to hope again. "Jonathan, you saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself. You offered opportunity when I expected only charity, partnership when I feared only dependency. I promise to bring the same creativity to our marriage that I bring to my designs, the same dedication to our love that I give to my artistry, and the same courage to our future that you gave me when I needed it most." When Father O'Sullivan pronounced them husband and wife, the cathedral erupted in applause that spoke of genuine celebration rather than mere social obligation. As Jonathan kissed her, Isabella felt the final transformation take place, from Isabella Martinez, the poor seamstress who had traded herself for bread, to Isabella Blackwood, successful artist, beloved wife, and living proof that love could indeed conquer all obstacles when it was built on mutual respect and shared dreams. The reception at the Blackwood mansion showcased every aspect of their remarkable partnership. Tables groaned under delicacies prepared by Boston's finest caterers, while musicians played arrangements that blended the Spanish folk songs of Isabella's childhood with the Irish melodies Jonathan remembered from his youth. The wedding cake, decorated with sugar flowers that replicated the embroidery patterns from Isabella's dress, stood as both culinary masterpiece and artistic statement. But the most meaningful moment came during the dancing, when Jonathan led Isabella onto the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The orchestra played a waltz that seemed written specifically for them, and as they moved together in perfect harmony, Isabella caught sight of their reflection in the ballroom's mirrors. What she saw was not a mismatched couple defying social convention, but two people who complemented each other so completely that their union seemed not just appropriate, but inevitable. As the evening drew to a close and guests began offering their final congratulations, Isabella found herself standing alone for a moment on the mansion's front steps, looking out over the gaslit streets of Beacon Hill. The neighborhood that had once seemed impossibly foreign now felt like home, while the life she was beginning felt like the natural result of choices made with courage rather than desperation. "Any regrets?" Jonathan asked, joining her in the cool night air. Isabella considered the question seriously, thinking about the paths not taken, the conventional choices she might have made if circumstances had been different. Then she looked at her wedding ring, a simple band of gold that matched the constellation patterns in her dress, and smiled. "Only one," she said. Jonathan's eyebrows rose in surprise. "And what's that?" "I regret that it took desperation to bring us together. I wish I could have met you when I was already strong enough to recognize my own worth, already confident enough to see myself as your equal from the beginning." Jonathan took her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding band that now proclaimed their union to the world. "But then you wouldn't have been you," he said gently. "The woman I fell in love with wasn't just talented and beautiful. She was someone who had faced the worst circumstances life could offer and emerged with her integrity intact. That strength, that resilience, that refusal to compromise your essential self even when survival was at stake, those qualities made you who you are." Isabella leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the security of belonging somewhere completely. "I used to think that poverty was my greatest enemy," she said. "Now I understand that it was just a temporary condition. My real enemy was believing that circumstances defined my limitations rather than my starting point." As they stood together, in the spring evening, surrounded by the evidence of their success and the promise of their shared future, Isabella thought about the poor seamstress who had approached a stranger on a dark street, willing to trade dignity for survival. That woman still existed within her, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how precious security could be. But she had been joined by someone new, someone who created beauty that told stories, who built businesses that provided opportunities for others, who loved and was loved completely by a man who saw her true worth. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. Tomorrow there would be new designs to create, new challenges to face, new opportunities to help other women discover their own potential. There would be social barriers to overcome, business obstacles to navigate, and the ongoing work of building a marriage that honored both partners' dreams. But tonight, standing in the glow of gas lamps with cherry blossom petals drifting on the evening breeze, Isabella Blackwood knew that she had achieved something more valuable than financial success or social recognition. She had learned to see herself through the eyes of love, not just Jonathan's love, but her own love for the woman she had become through courage, artistry, and the radical decision to believe that she deserved happiness. The poor seamstress who had traded herself for bread had become a woman who understood that the most valuable things in life, love, respect, artistic fulfillment, and genuine partnership, could never be bought or sold. They could only be earned through the kind of courage that chose hope over despair, possibility over limitation, and love over fear. And in the end, that transformation was worth more than all the silk dresses and constellation gowns in the world. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls of the Blackwood mansion on a crisp October morning, mixing with the steady hum of sewing machines from the expanded Constellation Couture workshop that now occupied an entire building on Newbury Street. Isabella stood at the nursery window, watching her 3-year-old daughter Eleanor chase autumn leaves in the garden, while their son Thomas, barely walking at 18 months, toddled after her with determined steps and infectious giggles. Eleanor had inherited her father's dark eyes and her mother's artistic temperament, already showing an uncanny ability to arrange her toys in patterns that suggested an innate understanding of color and design. Thomas possessed his mother's olive complexion and his father's stubborn determination, refusing assistance even when his chubby legs couldn't quite carry him where he wanted to go. Both children bore the confidence that came from being wanted, planned for, and celebrated from their first breath. The nursery itself reflected the blend of cultures and histories that defined their family. Spanish lullabies mixed with Irish folk songs on the music box Jonathan had commissioned from a craftsman in Dublin. Children's books, in both English and Spanish, filled the shelves, while toys crafted by artisans from Jonathan's Colorado ranch sat alongside dolls wearing miniature versions of Isabella's most famous designs. The room told the story of parents who wanted their children to understand both where they came from and the infinite possibilities that lay before them. Through the window, Isabella could see the carriage house that had been converted into a school, not just any school, but the Martinez Academy for Young Women, a revolutionary institution that provided education in both traditional subjects and practical skills to daughters of working families who might otherwise never have access to formal learning. The academy had been Isabella's idea, funded jointly by Constellation Couture's profits and Jonathan's investment portfolio, staffed by teachers who understood that intelligence and potential existed independent of economic circumstances. Maria Santos, the young seamstress Isabella had rescued from circumstances that mirrored her own past, now served as the Academy's Director of Practical Arts, teaching young women not just how to sew, but how to see themselves as creators capable of building independent lives. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that the woman who had once been willing to trade herself for bread now provided other women with the tools to ensure they would never face such desperate choices. "Mrs. Blackwood?" A gentle voice interrupted her reverie. Isabella turned to find Anna Kowalski, the children's governess, standing in the doorway with a telegram in her hands. Anna was a young Polish immigrant whose family had fled economic hardship in Europe, and whom Isabella had hired specifically because she understood the value of opportunity when it was offered with genuine respect. "This just arrived from San Francisco," Anna said, offering the telegram with the careful deference of someone who still marveled at working in a household where kindness was the norm rather than the exception. Isabella accepted the message and read the contents with growing excitement. Margaret Blackwood's fashion house in San Francisco had received an extraordinary commission. The California governor's wife wanted an entire trousseau designed by Isabella for her daughter's wedding to a railroad heir. But more significantly, 3 wealthy women in Sacramento had approached Margaret about establishing a West Coast branch of the Martinez Academy, offering to fund the venture entirely if Isabella would oversee its development. The request represented more than business opportunity. It suggested that their model of combining commercial success with social responsibility was spreading beyond Boston's progressive circles. Other cities, other women of means, were beginning to understand that investing in education for working-class women created benefits that extended far beyond individual transformation. "Good news?" Anna asked, recognizing the smile that had spread across Isabella's features. "Extraordinary news," Isabella replied. "It seems our little experiment in changing the world is attracting attention from people who want to help." The little experiment had grown beyond anything Isabella and Jonathan had originally envisioned. Constellation Couture now employed 47 seamstresses across 3 locations, each one carefully selected not just for technical skill, but for dedication to the artistry that set their work apart from mass-produced fashion. The Martinez Academy had graduated its first class of students 6 months ago, young women who had gone on to positions as teachers, shopkeepers, bookkeepers, and skilled craftswomen, careers that provided independence and dignity rather than mere survival. But perhaps most importantly, their marriage had become a model for other couples who dared to choose love over social convention. Isabella regularly received letters from women who had married outside their social class, men who had prioritized personal happiness over family expectations, and young people who found courage in the example of 2 people who had refused to accept that circumstances of birth determined the boundaries of possibility. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor that reminded Isabella of how dramatically her world had expanded. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore arrived in her customary style, announced by the sound of an expensive carriage on cobblestones, preceded by a footman carrying packages wrapped in tissue paper, and followed by an aura of barely contained energy that made every room seem smaller by comparison. "Isabella, darling," Mrs. Whitmore declared, sweeping into the drawing room where Isabella had been reviewing sketches for the Sacramento Commission. "I bring news that will either delight you or cause you to reach for smelling salts." At 68, Mrs. Whitmore had become something of a fairy godmother to Isabella's enterprises, using her considerable influence to open doors and silence critics who might otherwise have created obstacles. Her own fashion empire had benefited enormously from carrying Isabella's designs, but her support went beyond mere business calculation. She genuinely admired women who created their own success through talent and determination. "Given your dramatic presentation, I suspect it's news that will require celebration rather than medical intervention," Isabella replied, setting aside her sketches to give her visitor full attention. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was positively predatory. "Harper's Bazaar wants to feature you on their cover for the Christmas issue. Not just your designs, mind you, but you personally. They want to do a complete profile, your background, your transformation, your marriage, your business philosophy, everything." Isabella felt her breath catch. Harper's Bazaar was the most prestigious fashion publication in America, read by every woman of means from Boston to San Francisco. A cover story would represent recognition at the highest level of American society, validation that transcended regional acceptance. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitmore continued, clearly enjoying the effect of her announcement. They want to photograph you wearing your own designs, in your own home, with your children. They want to present you not as an anomaly or curiosity, but as an example of the new American woman, someone who has achieved success through talent rather than inheritance, who has built a marriage based on partnership rather than submission, who represents the future rather than the past. The implications were staggering. Such coverage would cement Isabella's position not just as a successful businesswoman, but as a cultural figure whose story carried meaning beyond personal achievement. It would provide a platform to discuss the Martinez Academy, to advocate for educational opportunities for working women, to challenge assumptions about what women could accomplish when given genuine opportunities. "There's one condition," Mrs. Whitmore added, her expression growing more serious. "They want complete honesty, no sanitized version of your background, no attempt to minimize the poverty you escaped or the desperation that led you to approach Jonathan on that dark street. They want the real story, told without apology or embarrassment." Isabella considered this requirement, thinking about the young women at the Martinez Academy who struggled with shame about their circumstances, who believed that poverty somehow reflected personal failing rather than economic structure. A frank discussion of her own past, published in America's most influential fashion magazine, could provide those women with evidence that transformation was possible, that current circumstances need not define future potential. "When do they want to begin?" she asked. Mrs. Whitmore's grin could have illuminated the entire room. "The photographer arrives next week." That evening, as Isabella and Jonathan sat in their private study reviewing the day's correspondence and business matters, she shared the news of the Harper's Bazaar opportunity. Jonathan's response was characteristically thoughtful. He understood both the tremendous potential and the possible risks of such public exposure. "Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" he asked, setting aside a letter from his ranch foreman in Colorado. "Once your story appears in Harper's Bazaar, there will be no privacy left. Everyone will know everything about your background, our courtship, your business methods, our family life." Isabella reached for his hand, feeling the familiar comfort of his strong fingers intertwined with hers. "I've been thinking about that. 5 years ago, I would have been terrified of such exposure because I believed my past was something shameful, something that needed to be hidden or explained away. But now I understand that my story isn't unusual, it's just uncommonly visible." She paused, organizing thoughts that had been developing for months as she watched young women graduate from the Martinez Academy and begin building independent lives. How many women in America right now are where I was 5 years ago? How many are working for wages that barely sustain life, believing that their circumstances represent their limitations rather than their starting point? If my story can reach even a few of those women, if it can convince them that transformation is possible, then whatever temporary discomfort comes from public scrutiny will be worthwhile. Jonathan's smile was filled with the pride and admiration that had never dimmed since their first meeting. "In that case, we should make sure the story they tell is complete and accurate. The world should know exactly what you've accomplished, exactly what it took to get here, and exactly what you're building for the future." The Harper's Bazaar photographer, a surprisingly young woman named Catherine Mills, who had trained in the finest studios of New York and Paris, arrived the following week with an entourage of assistants and enough equipment to outfit a small army. But her approach was refreshingly straightforward. She wanted to capture Isabella not as an exotic curiosity, but as a working woman who had built something meaningful through talent and determination. The photographs were taken throughout the mansion and the Constellation Couture workshop, showing Isabella in various aspects of her life, designing new garments at her drawing table, working alongside seamstresses in the workshop, playing with her children in the garden, sharing an intimate dinner with Jonathan in their dining room. Each image told part of the larger story, creating a visual narrative that would accompany the written profile. But the most powerful photograph was taken in the workshop, showing Isabella teaching a young student from the Martinez Academy how to execute a complex embroidery technique. The image captured not just technical instruction, but the transfer of possibility from one generation to the next, the way knowledge and opportunity could multiply when shared with generosity rather than hoarded for personal advantage. The interview process proved equally revealing, as Isabella found herself articulating ideas about women's potential, social responsibility, and the relationship between commercial success and personal fulfillment that she had never expressed so completely before. The journalist, a Harvard-educated woman named Rebecca Thornton, asked probing questions that required Isabella to examine her own motivations and methods with unusual clarity. "What do you want people to understand about your transformation?" Rebecca asked during their final interview session. Isabella considered the question carefully, thinking about the desperate woman who had approached Jonathan on a dark street, the artist who had created beauty from raw materials, the businesswoman who had built an empire, the wife and mother who had found fulfillment in love and family, the educator who was trying to create opportunities for others. "I want them to understand that circumstances are temporary, but character is permanent," she said finally. "Poverty didn't make me less intelligent, less creative, or less worthy of love. It just limited my opportunities to demonstrate those qualities. When someone offered me a genuine opportunity, when someone saw potential rather than just present, reality, everything changed." She paused, then added with the conviction that came from lived experience, "Most importantly, I want people to understand that helping others transform their lives isn't charity, it's investment. Every woman who escapes poverty, who develops her talents, who builds an independent life, makes the entire community stronger. We succeed together or we fail alone." When the Harper's Bazaar issue was published in December, it created exactly the sensation Mrs. Whitmore had predicted. The cover photograph showed Isabella in the midnight constellation gown that had launched her career, but the accompanying headline read simply, "The Future of American Fashion and the Woman Who Created It." The article inside, illustrated with Catherine Mills's photographs and written with Rebecca Thornton's keen insight, told Isabella's story without romanticizing the poverty or minimizing the obstacles she had faced. It presented her transformation as both inspirational and instructive, providing a roadmap for other women who might find themselves in similar circumstances. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters arrived from across the country, from working women who had found new hope in Isabella's example, from wealthy women who wanted to support similar educational initiatives in their own cities, from young couples who had found courage to marry for love rather than social convenience. Most surprisingly, inquiries came from European fashion houses who wanted to license Isabella's designs for international markets. Recognition that American creativity was finally being taken seriously by establishments that had once considered the New World a cultural backwater. But the letter that moved Isabella most deeply came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Caroline Ashworth, writing from her family's estate in New York, had seen the Harper's Bazaar article and felt compelled to reach out with an apology that was both gracious and revealing. "I have spent the past 5 years believing that Jonathan made a terrible mistake in choosing you over me," Caroline wrote in her elegant script. "I convinced myself that his decision represented poor judgment clouded by inappropriate infatuation. But reading about your achievements, seeing the life you have built together, understanding the impact you are having on other women's lives, I realized that he chose exactly the right person. Not despite your unconventional background, but because of the strength and vision that background had given you. I wish you both continued happiness and success. The letter represented more than personal reconciliation. It suggested that even the most rigid social conventions could evolve when confronted with evidence of success and genuine accomplishment. As Isabella folded Caroline's letter and placed it in the box where she kept important correspondence, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The Harper's Bazaar article had described her transformation in terms that emphasized individual achievement and personal triumph. But Isabella understood that her story was really about the power of connection between teacher and student, between business partners, between husband and wife, between women who supported each other's dreams rather than competing for limited opportunities. Looking out her study window at the lights of Boston twinkling in the December darkness, Isabella could see the Martinez Academy building where young women were studying by lamplight, preparing for examinations that would determine their futures. In a few years, those students would graduate and begin building independent lives, and some of them would undoubtedly create opportunities for the next generation of women seeking transformation. The ripple effects of possibility spreading outward, from one moment of desperate courage on a dark street, expanding to touch lives that hadn't even begun yet. That, Isabella realized, was the true measure of success. Not the gowns she had created, or the money she had earned, or even the love she had found, but the number of other women who would never have to choose between dignity and survival because someone had shown them there were other options available. The poor seamstress who had traded herself for bread had become a woman who understood that the most valuable currency wasn't money or social position, but the power to help others discover their own worth. And that transformation, multiplied across generations of women who would never accept limitations as permanent conditions, would indeed change the world, one perfect stitch at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.